Howdy, it's Mr. Russell and welcome to your first forensic science video on observation skills. Here's the vocabulary we'll be covering. You may not have heard of deductive reasoning, but you probably heard of eyewitness fact or forensic. Remember, perception and opinion and observations can mean different things, so make sure you check the textbook for those definitions. Just to start off, the forensic investigator needs to observe, interpret, and report. Those are three separate things that an investigator needs to do. One thing to help us observe is to lay out the crime scene in a grid, just like this. That way it's easy to focus on one select area right here, so that you can really focus and train your eyes just to look at one square and then move on to the next square. This is a very simple diagram of how our brain will actually just process information. We get a whole lot of information from our senses, those five senses: touch, see, smell, taste, and feel. Yeah, and I'm missing one. Oh no. And then we pay attention to only a certain part of it. Now, our perception is based off of past experience and just how we are, and then it gets stored in the short-term memory. And the short-term memory only lasts about 5 to 10 minutes. And then whenever you go to sleep, your brain will actually store it into the long-term memory if it decides it needs to keep that information. So notice that the arrows go down. There's fewer arrows every time you move to a different block. So not all information perceived from our senses gets stored in a long-term memory. Our brains constantly are just applying filters and separating things out just because there's way too much information. Our perception is just very limited. And it's not always going to be 100% accurate and based off the facts. It's just what we're seeing right there. So it's more of part of an opinion, but not really a fact. Now, your observations can be affected big time by your emotional states. If you're very stressed, you may not be able to be observed. Be able to observe. Your body is really trying to fight for its life almost, and really try to defend itself. So that's why people who are assaulted or in very stressful situations don't make very good witnesses. And also just the number of people around. If there's 100 people in a room, crammed in a tiny room, you're not going to be able to remember everybody's face. You've probably seen these on TV where they'll take several different mugshots and they'll put them and they'll show them to a witness, and if the person points to the right person, then that could lead to a conviction. But remember that this person only has a 1 out of 6 chance of choosing the right person, so the probability is still not in the favor of a true conviction. Eyewitness accounts can be very dependable, but they can also be very terrible. They can go back and forth. And it really has to do with how involved the person is and how involved the observer is. Also, on how trained they are, if they're a trained observer or not. The eyewitness can be, their perceptions and their observations can be affected by these things, prejudices, the beliefs, and their motives as well. It's also important to question an eyewitness immediately after the crime scene, because even after a delay of 5 or 10 minutes can really alter their testimony. This is an interesting thing called the Innocence Project. It was led by these two gentlemen here, and that school of law, where they used DNA to go back and look at people who had already been convicted and declared guilty, and then they actually conclusively decided if it was guilt or innocence. What they found out was that the 80%, 87% of the wrongful convictions were because of faulty eyewitness accounts. So an eyewitness can really lead up to a false conviction. So that's why the jury isn't supposed to put too much weight on an eyewitness. To be a good observer, we need to follow a couple of steps and really have a trained eye. You want to start at one part of the crime scene and just very slowly scan your eyes and look at every single little detail, left to right, and you want to look at it systematically, just left to right, bottom to top, or top to bottom. Look carefully at everything you see, and you can do that even when you're looking at a microscope. Since your brain has naturally got some kind of filter on it, there's going to be some sort of human error. You have to really kind of try to train yourself out of that, and make sure that you act like a robot instead, where you are taking in too much information, and try to take in more information that you think you will need. You definitely want to avoid jumping to the conclusions, because that can it can alter your perception and how you are making your observations. You need to focus on just the facts and the concrete information first, and then whenever you leave, and you have all the data, then you can start making conclusions. And really the last thing is to compensate for such a poor short-term memory, is to write everything down, and that's why we photograph as much as we can. Try to get all the angles, all the scales, just to make sure that everything is correct and at the right place, because thinking back on it and relying on your memory is not a good way to go. So here's a picture of what a lot of crime scene investigators will look like, and you will look like this too. And it will give you a sore back, so you may want to just have to get used to it. So what we're concerned with is not trying to convict somebody. We're trying to uncover the facts. We're going to go into this more in detail next week, but we're really worried about the facts. We're not worried about catching somebody or putting somebody behind bars. We want to get the facts. So me, as a forensic scientist, I'm only interested in collecting and examining physical evidence. That's all I'm interested in. I'm not trying to make the suspect look guilty. That's the detective's job. That's different than the forensic scientist. We'll also have to find, examine, and evaluate evidence, and we'll have to use our knowledge of science, but we also have to communicate our knowledge of science to the court of law. That would be the judge, the jury, the lawyers, everyone in there, so that our opinions can be heard, because our opinions are considered expert opinions. So in summary, our ability to observe is affected by our environment and the natural filters of sensory information in our brains. We did learn that observations can be faulty, and that eyewitnesses are not very reliable. We learned about the Innocence Project, that actually found that 87% of their wrongful conviction cases were from eyewitnesses. And we also learned that police officers and CSI investigators have a trained eye. This has to be something very trained, and that forensic scientists are only interested in the science, not proving someone guilty. And that's all I have for Chapter 1. Thank you for watching.